Good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick Milliken from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And thanks for joining us for another of our virtual events. Today, we have back on our program here Ann Williams, the general editor for the National Geographic, who has this just gorgeous, as Barbara's holding it up too, book, Treasures of Egypt, A Legacy and Photographs from the Pyramids to Cleopatra. And the folks from National Geographic sent me a bunch of images. So I'll be happy to put those up on the screen in a moment. But welcome, Ann.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be back with you.
So last year we did a wonderful event with Ann and Douglas Preston called Lost Cities and Ancient Tombs. And hilariously, Doug, who thought maybe 25 people would want his signature, had agreed to sign the introduction. It was like 500 books later that we finally had to say, because books like this are extremely difficult to ship around. He had no idea what he was letting himself in for. Neither did we. But anyway, it was a real pleasure. So this time around, we don't have autographed copies. We have this fabulous book, which is one of my great recommendations for Christmas, because this is still is November today, the 100th anniversary of the discovery and opening of King Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon. And it's back in the news, not only because of the discovery, but there are now some interesting theories that who the tomb was meant for, and maybe there's more beyond it. There's an Oxford archaeologist, you probably know who he is, and I can't think of his name, who's got a theory that this is the anteroom for a bigger tomb. And if they could just see through the wall or punch a hole in the wall or something, which nobody really wants to do, they could discover whether that's true. And partly that is the very difficult family history of King Tutankhamun, and that the whole family of Akhenaten and Nefertiti and the whole bit. So lots to talk about. I want to show you, because I really like this. This is a picture that is taken in the old Egyptian Museum, which is a Victorian building. Do you remember when it was built, Ann?
I believe it opened in 1902.
So not quite Victorian, it's really Edwardian.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it's old. And it's not ideal as a museum in terms of taking care of its treasures. It was built before climate controls, air conditioning. The lighting when I was there was absolutely terrible. And security, not necessarily great. So this is one of the reasons that Egypt is building its, what's it called? The Great
Grand Egyptian Museum, or as we popularly call it, the GEM. It's about a little over a mile's walk to the northwest of the pyramids at Giza. And I believe there's going to be a walkway constructed so that if people want to take that stroll, they can take it. The GEM is really quite a wonderful facility. It has been 10 years in the design and construction. It cost $1 billion with a B dollars to build. But when it finally opens, and we're waiting for that to happen any minute, it is just going to be wonderful. I got a sneak preview in 2019 on a tour when I was in Egypt. We saw the museum, it was almost done. And it was just glorious. But it's not only a museum, it is a whole sort of complex for the display and study of antiquities. It includes, I think, 10 state-of-the-art conservation labs. It includes facilities for scholars. It includes facilities for conventions to be held there, and this big, amazing museum. And so it is just, we are just all waiting for it to open, putting it on our bucket list, saying, I hope the next time I go to Egypt, this thing will be open. But what is happening is that there have been decisions made about moving some key artifacts out of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo
Right.
and moving them to the gem. And that includes, but is not limited to, all of King Tutankhamun's stuff.
Right.
And King Tut's stuff, I mean, some of it was on display at the Downtown Museum in Cairo. I know there used to be a textile museum near the Khan el Khalili, the big market in the downtown old part of Cairo. And I know for sure Tut's clean linen underwear were in that museum because I saw them there. I know
Hmm.
also that there are a lot of things in storage. And so one of the wonderful things about the gem is that there are galleries that have been purposely designed and constructed to put together all of King Tutankhamun's stuff, all the more than 5,000 items from his tomb, to reunite those things for the first time in 100 years. They will all be brought together in those galleries in the new museum. So that's just one of the wonderful things that's going to happen. The other thing that I think, since you brought up the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, I've seen photographs of it now, and they really are making a concerted effort to make the lighting better, make the signage better, make the displays more intriguing and more informative. So this is all part of Egypt's effort right now to build new museums, to make the country more attractive for tourists so that people can visit the Egyptian Museum in downtown Cairo, which is just a step away from some of the big hotels,
Yeah.
and go to the gem and go to the National Museum of the Egyptian Civilization, which just opened, and where all the mummies have been moved. So it really is a wonderful time for Egypt because it's showcasing all of these new things.
Well, and it also is highlighting the fact that Egyptians are finally taking charge of their own archaeology and their own museumology, which, was not the case. Carnarvon was British, and, many of the archaeologists that given us the Egypt that we think of, I mean, most of them were not Egyptian. So I really like the idea that they are doing that. I spent a whole day in the Cairo Museum. We were staying at the Sofitel, which is at Tahrir Square, and we were there, interestingly enough, in January of right before the desert, the
Arab
you remember
Spring.
what they call it,
Oh,
Desert Spring.
goodness.
And
Wow.
I had broken a bone in my leg. So while everybody else went to Giza and Saqqara, where I had already been, and which I knew I couldn't walk, I was able to, with the hotel's assistance, get to the museum in Cairo, which is very close to Tahrir Square, and spend an entire day there. And I was absolutely fascinated. But then I have to tell you, Anne, that as a person who was addicted to Elizabeth Peters' amazing Amelia Peabody series, I think any fan of historical mystery probably has read the Amelia Peabodys, which are based upon an actual, I can't think of her name at the moment, but an actual British archaeologist or woman anyway, who traveled in Egypt. And so seeing it all was amazing. And Akhenaten, the statues of him were not with the King Tut, which was up on the second floor in the front and had, I have to tell you, really terrible lighting, and it was all dusty. But it would be nice if that whole sort of family could be grouped together in the new museum so that there was some continuity, in it. But we're here to talk about the whole thing. So Patrick, what images have you got that you would like to display that Anne could discuss? Because we're talking about generations, millennia actually, and this wonderful book does not stint on taking you from 3000 or earlier BC down to the reign of, it ends with Cleopatra, which of course is when Ptolemaic Egypt came to an end and Rome took over.
I'm a very linear thinker, so I have begun that book at the beginning. I began it with some of the early settlements where kings came from, Abydos and Nechan, which later became called Hierakonpolis down in the south, and then I go right through to Cleopatra. chronologically. I've also structured it sort of like an atlas. My idea was that a lot of people don't go to Egypt or think about Egypt, saying, I want to know everything there is to know about the Old Kingdom. They say, on Tuesday, we're going to Giza. What's that all about? And
Right.
so, that is how I structured the book, so that people can open it up and find out about this. Now, this photograph, I believe, is Abu Simbel.
It is.
As you see, it is before the archaeologists got there, so you can really see how the sand has shifted in. And I don't know whether people can see the full frame, but at the bottom of the photograph, there's a tiny human. I'm not seeing him, but there is a very tiny human. So that, yes, there he is.
There
so
he
you
is.
see the scale of those just enormous seated statues of Ramses II. Ramses II was one of the great pharaohs of Egypt, and he was exceptional in so many ways.
Mhm.
He was young when he took over the throne, and he lived into his 90s. So he really sat on the throne for 60 years or so, which meant, and he had more wives than we can count. And we think he had more than 100 children. So you can just imagine what a household that was. And the problem with that was that, because he sat on the throne so long, some of his sons had begun to die by the time, he left this earth. So that created, lots of problems after he reigned. But anyway, this temple at Abu Simbel is one of the great, one of his great statements about who he was and how vast his territories were, because Abu Simbel was down into what we now call Nubia.
Right.
Now, this is a wonderful photograph. This is from Tutankhamun's tomb, and we are looking from what we now call the antechamber into the burial chamber. So you see there is still some of that mud sealing the entrance to the burial chamber. And you can see some of the stamps that were put on that mud ceiling to let everybody know that officials had sealed that that opening. And inside the burial chamber, what you see here is one of the walls of the outermost funerary shrine. So these funerary shrines were nested. I believe there were 4 of them. And from there, you get to that famous photograph of Howard Carter kneeling in front of one of those shrines, and there is rope wrapped around one of the handle that closes it, and that rope is sealed with another official seal. And that was the moment when Howard Carter was able to say, aha, this is an untouched burial. When we get into here, we are going to find King Tut in, whatever state he is after 3,000 years. And here we see on the outside in the antechamber, guarding the doorway, we see 2 guardian statues, which are very cool. So
They are very cool.
I
I have a photo on my phone, which I found, which I was just, well, I can't, I'll show it to you. I have a couple of photos of what it looks like right now. Sorry, Rob. It's the dogs have just come home. Beg your pardon. Oh, that's a beautiful picture. And that's
Now,
Philae.
I believe this is the temple at Philae.
Yeah.
And this is this was a Greco-Roman temple. So sort of later on in the time period, it was, Greco, meaning Cleopatra's family descended from one of the generals that accompanied Alexander the Great in his conquest of Egypt. So they were Greek speaking. And then after the Greeks, after Cleopatra made, such a mess with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the Romans came in. And so this temple dates from that time period. But this temple has a similar modern story to Abu Simbel, because the Nile River back in antiquity flooded every year. It would rain in Ethiopia like crazy. The monsoons would come, and then that water would flood Egypt. Now, that was a good thing because it carried rich volcanic soil from Ethiopia and spread it over the fields of the Nile, the fields of Egypt. And then when it stopped raining in Ethiopia, the Nile would recede, drop that silt, and that would be natural fertilization for the farmers. But when the rains were too ferocious, the communities on the edge of the floodplain really got hit. People and animals got killed, buildings got destroyed. So there was a thought. Well, actually, quite a number of times there were older dams that were built on the Nile to try to control it. And then in about 1960, the Egyptian government started to build what is now known as the Aswan High Dam. And that was great because it controlled the Nile so that there was not this wild flooding. It also generates a lot of electrical power, which is, wonderful for the people living in Egypt. But there were a lot of ancient sites like Philae, like Abu Simbel, that were going to be covered by the lake that was created when the dam was built. That lake is Lake Nasser. And so there was an international rescue program put together, spearheaded by Egypt on the one hand and UNESCO, I believe, on the other. And they literally cut apart Abu Simbel and moved it to higher ground. And they literally pulled apart these temples, which were once on the island of Philae, and they moved them to a nearby island that was higher, that was not going to be flooded. So I believe in this picture, you see the temples in their new place. These temples have been deconstructed and moved to this higher island. Oh, this.
Wait, could you go back, Patrick, for a minute? I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had muted myself because the dogs were shrieking. If you go back to the top of that photograph, that is the Aswan High Dam, that kind of brown line that goes across there. And to visit this island, you sail from over there on the, you can see their boats, and you sail around the island. I mean, you land, you can see the landing place, but it's really interesting to circumnavigate this island and see these tombs or temples from, from different aspects. And there's a small one, different from the big one, that really is interesting with stuff inside it. But we also have the Temple of Dendur in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which, was raised by all this.
And that was part of the deal. That
Yeah.
I believe the Met got that temple.
They did.
Because it was going to be, one of it was going to be flooded. Yeah. So this is one of the most wonderful chapters and one of the most intriguing chapters of modern archaeology. This is the solid silver coffin of a late period king named Susenes. And his tomb was in the northern part of Egypt in what we call the Delta. And a French archaeologist was digging there. It's a site that we know of as Tanis, and he was digging there in the late 1930s and early 1940, and he found a number of royal burials, including the burial of this king, and there was a lot of gold, a lot of silver, but the rest of the world was right on the brink of World War II. And all of the headlines were consumed with the impending war and what it was going to mean and what it was going to entail. And this discovery was just not really covered at all. And so a lot of people who are not in the business of Egyptology don't know about this king and don't know about this fabulous coffin and this really quite wonderful treasure that was found in the tomb of this king. Now, back when the things of King Tutankhamun were still in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, this sarcophagus, I believe, was in the next room beside all of King Tut's bling. So people would go in and see the golden mask of King Tut and all of his necklaces and all of his bracelets and all of his other fabulous jewelry, and their eyes would just be so bugged out that they didn't even stop in and see Susenes. But it really is worth seeing. There was a time in ancient Egyptian history that that silver was considered to be even more precious than gold. And to the ancient Egyptians, the skin of the gods was gold and their bones were silver. So that is part of the symbolism that you're seeing here. These were eternal metals and really belonged to the gods. And so that's why they were used in royal burials.
It looks like the uraeus, though, the part of the headdress is in gold, is it?
Oh, yes. And the iconography has continued on for, 2,500 years at this point. Oh, this is so wonderful too. This is the new museum in Alexandria, and it really is quite wonderful. I was there about a month ago, and just, I've been there a number of times before, and I just stood there again, loving this building all over again. So, the story of Alexandria was that it was founded by Alexander the Great after his conquest of Egypt. And then the city of Alexandria grew to be just a wonderful, interesting, cosmopolitan center of trade and learning and scholarship and culture. And there was a very famous library there that was filled with, it was a repository of all of the learning that could be gathered at that time period. And sadly, it burnt in antiquity. And you can just imagine all of the wisdom that that building contained. But of course, all of that stuff, unlike previous eras when texts would have been very often written on pieces of clay, tablets of clay, so that they have been preserved for us. Books and scrolls and texts that are written on papyrus, one goes up in flames and everything goes up in flames. And that's what happened to that building. So there was a decision made some years ago now, because I remember seeing this museum, maybe 20 years ago, this library about 20 years ago. So there was a decision made, maybe 30 years ago, that they really needed to resurrect a library, a state-of-the-art library where scholars could come from around the world and build it right here in Alexandria in memory of that ancient library that burnt. And so this facility is just so gorgeous. And if I were a scholar, I would be very happy indeed to be studying there.
It is. The location is fabulous. It's on the Mediterranean, and it's really beautiful. The other cool thing is that any person can actually sign into their website and create their own bookshelf at the Library of Alexandria. So they have remarkable treasures. And so I have done that, and my friend Dana Stabenow, the author that I traveled to Egypt with the last time, we each have our own bookshelf at the Library of Alexandria.
The other thing that this library has done, oh, well, we're moving on to something else. Never mind.
Well, go ahead, finish. It's all right.
Yeah, the other thing that this library has done is when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt in the late 1700s, he brought a lot of scientists along with him. So along with the soldiers came people who knew about the natural world, people who knew about architecture, people who knew about antiquities. And Napoleon said to them, go out and find stuff. And so they did. And, back in the olden days, they didn't have photographs. And so they drew everything. And these drawings and descriptions of everything that they saw, everything from birds to temples and tombs, all of these things were put in about 24 oversized leather-bound volumes that wealthy scholars subscribed to, because they didn't publish all of these volumes all at once. They would do one year, and then the next year they do another. And so it was stretched out over, maybe some years. And but to have that collection, oh my goodness, if I were a wealthy woman, that is one of the things that I would buy. I would love to have one of the old complete sets. It's called the Description d'Égypte. And but this library, the Alexandria Library, has digitized all of those volumes. And so you can go in and you can pull up those pages, and they are just glorious. If you're interested in that sort of thing, that is one of the wonderful things that you can do.
It is wonderful. And I should have mentioned that when I say you can have your own bookshelf, it's all digital. It isn't like they put actual books in the library on your shelf. It means that you can put digital images and so forth. That's also Napoleon's campaign that was responsible for finding the Rosetta Stone, which was the key to understanding the hieroglyphs. It was translated eventually or figured out by Jean, what is his name, Champollion? A little bit later, but Napoleon did do a lot to bring some of historic Egypt's treasures forward.
Well, we are actually, this is a double celebration year, because it is not only the 100th anniversary of the discovery of King Tut's tomb, it is the 200th anniversary of the announcement in September 1822, made by Jean-François Champollion, that he had cracked the hieroglyphic code. Right. Ever since explorers and archaeologists had been going to Egypt, they had been seeing hieroglyphs on the walls of tombs and temples and monuments, but they couldn't read it. The ability to read had been lost. And it really is a very complicated language. I've studied it a bit. I still read hieroglyphs like I'm in pre-K. I can read my name, I can count to 10, but I can tell you it is very difficult. And there had been some progress made before 1822. There was a very smart English polymath named Thomas Young who was working on that puzzle. There was a Swedish man by the name of Eckerblad who was also working on it. There was a Frenchman named de Saussure. He was working on it. And Jean-François Champollion was de Saussure's student. But Jean-François Champollion was really quite exceptional because by the time he was in his early 20s, I mean, he knew something like a dozen languages, everything from Greek and Latin. Well, of course, you could predict that. But, Hebrew and Aramaic and Akkadian cuneiform, I mean, and so he really had a sense of how languages functioned and the bits of languages and how they fit together. And he was the one who really understood how hieroglyphs functioned, that it's really very complicated. A sign can actually be what it is. In other words, you see a sign and it looks like a bull and it does mean bull. But that sign has a pronunciation value. I think it's ka. And so that can be combined with other images, other hieroglyphs. And so that image doesn't mean bull. It just means for you to pronounce it as that sign is pronounced, but it's part of a larger, word. And then it can also be a collective noun because that sign of a bull can mean a herd of bulls, not just one bull. So, very complicated.
Very complicated. The royal names were put in what are called cartouche, so they had sort of a framework around them, and it was like a signet ring, more or less, that functioned that way. And Champollion was able to do this translation because part of the Rosetta Stone, there are 3 different languages, the hieroglyphs, was in Greek and Old Greek, and I think the middle was Demotic, and so he could take the Greek and then go to the Egyptian Demotic, and then he could go to the hieroglyphs. I think if it had just been hieroglyphs, it's not clear to me that he could have really worked it all out.
Oh no, that was the key. So what you have with the Rosetta Stone is part of a decree.
Yeah.
And it was put in these 3 kinds of scripts to make sure that everybody could read it. So at the bottom, and it's triangular shape. So at the bottom, you have the biggest bit, which is classical Greek. And then the middle is Demotic. Friends of mine who have studied it call it demonic because it really is very difficult. That's sort of a scripty way of writing hieroglyphs. And then at the top, the smallest bit, the top of the triangle are, I think, 14 precious lines and hieroglyphs. But because scholars at the time that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, scholars normally would learn Latin and ancient Greek, they could translate that ancient Greek pretty quickly. And then that gave them a springboard to start working on the hieroglyphic signs at the top part of the stone. And you are absolutely right. The royal names are in cartouche, and those were part of the key because names are made up of hieroglyphs. And so, if you can compare this guy's name with something in ancient Greek, well, then that helps you figure out what those signs are.
It was a remarkable achievement. I have visited the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum in London, and I was going to ask you, Anne, because there's all this controversy about things in colonial countries being, returned to the place of origin. Is the Rosetta Stone still in London? Is it still with the British?
The Rosetta Stone is still indeed in London.
Okay.
And it is, as I've said in other venues, I mean, you can walk right by it. It doesn't look like anything. I mean, unless you're actually looking for it, it's
Yeah.
very easy to walk
Or
by
you
it.
know what it is,
Just
that
looks
that
like a
makes all
big,
the difference. All right,
just
so
looks like
now
a
here we are, and they're wonderful statues, but they're missing things. Which temple is this?
Now, I can't quite remember what this was. I think we are also, again, looking at statues of
Ramses?
Ramses. Yeah. And this is just, again,
Hmm.
he was one of the, he was such an egotist. I tease sometimes and say that when you're traveling in Egypt as a tourist, it sometimes seems like every day is Ramses' second day. I mean, he just filled Egypt with colossal statues of himself.
Yeah, but he built to last too, to be fair,
Yeah, and he was on the throne for a very long time, so we had a long time to build stuff. But that's just very typical of what he would do. He would just, have endless statues, endless, extremely large statues of himself.
Okay,
built.
this is actually Ramses' mortuary temple, known as the Ramesseum. I
Mhm,
found it in the book. And the king is depicted in the form of a god, in the form of the god Osiris, and he's
mhm.
standing at each pillar of the portico. And Osiris is a central character in the Egyptian pantheon of gods. And so the pharaohs would try to, resemble him or look after him and so forth. And I'm trying to remember, is the Ramesseum, is it near Karnak? Where in the world is it?
Well, so the Ramesseum is on the west bank of the Nile.
Right.
So in ancient Egypt, it's not all the time, but usually you will have living people on the east bank and dead people on the west bank,
Right.
because of course the sun dies in the west every day, right? And so that was part of the symbolism that the ancient Egyptians were thinking about when they put a lot of their cemeteries in the west. And in fact, sometimes when Egyptologists these days die and we get an alert through email about this person's passing, the email will say Dr. X has gone west.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So anyway, this is on the West Bank and it's on the way when you're going to the Valley of the Kings. You will probably pass this on your tour bus. And your tour bus may even stop here. It's one of the places where tourists get off and walk around and have a look.
Yep.
Ooh, I don't remember where this is. Help me.
Interesting faces. It might be Karnak. It might be the big temple in the actual city, but I can't remember for sure. But you can see the lotus represented on top of the pyramid. The capital of the pyramid before you get to the image is a lotus, I believe.
Well, and this looks to me like Hathor because she has those little cow ears. And so that was, she very often appears at the top of columns.
Carry on, Peter. There we go. Ah, we're inside a tomb now.
Well,
Oh, I love this one. This is one of my favorites.
this is one of the very typical images of what is called the heretic rule of Akhenaten.
Right.
So we are in what is called the New Kingdom. And when that starts, around about 1500 BC, there's a series of what I call great warrior kings, and they sort of they not only sort of restore Egypt internally, because Egypt had sort of fallen apart for a period, but they start conquering territory to the north and south of Egypt. And so during the rule of these warrior kings and the rule of Ramses II, who comes a little later. Egypt had its greatest expanse of territory. Egyptian territory went right up along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, almost actually over the border of what is now Turkey, and then it went down south into what is now Sudan. But Amenhotep III was one of the great warrior kings and one of the great pharaohs in the entire 3,000 year sweep of pharaonic history. But unfortunately, his firstborn son died. And so the second born son, whose name was also Amenhotep, was the son who was the heir apparent. Now, during the time of Amenhotep III, Amenhotep III got to be very interested in a god that was represented, as you see here, as the disk of the sun, reaching down with its rays to dispense blessings upon the people beneath it. So already under Amenhotep III, there was an interest in this god. Well, so Amenhotep III dies, and his son Amenhotep became Amenhotep IV, and he takes the throne, and he does, some things that are kind of normal. He gets married, which a pharaoh has to do. Pharaoh has to get married, have children. So he marries a woman who is now very famous, a woman named Nefertiti. He also does some building in the temple complex at Karnak. And, the statues, they look a little weird, but, they're not out of line. All of a sudden, for some reason, around year 5 of Amenhotep IV's reign, he goes a little bonkers. He decides that he is going to leave what we now know as Luxor. Back in those days, it was a city named Waset, and it had been his family's capital for, decades and generations. He decides he's going to leave that, and he's going to go out into the desert, and he is going to build a capital from scratch. And he changes his name to Akhenaten, so he who is effective for the god Aten. And he names his new capital Akhetaten, or horizon of the Aten. And he decides that the official god of ancient Egypt is going to be, this crazy sun god. He officially suppresses some gods, most especially Amun, who was one of the main gods back in Karnak. Most especially, people think, because the priests of Amun were very wealthy and very powerful, and the king, did not want competition for what he was doing. But this whole kind of chapter was so weird, and actually really, very horrific. First of all, this was breaking with tradition in a way that Egyptians must have found deeply uncomfortable. And also, all of the people who had to leave Luxor, Waset, and move to this, basically construction site in the middle of nowhere, they must have been deeply unhappy as well. They were leaving their homes, they were leaving all their connections, they were leaving this wonderful, sophisticated, cosmopolitan city and, moving to where? The middle of dust. So people must, you just can imagine how unhappy people were. But Akhenaten, worshipped the Aten, and, here he is, and the sun god is pouring its blessings down upon people. Hear him in this relief. Now, as soon as Akhenaten drops dead, people start leaving Akhetaten. It was just, it was in the middle of nowhere, and they moved back to Waset, what we now know as Luxor. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in order to build that capital super fast, Akhenaten commanded that stones be cut in a much smaller size than they had traditionally been cut before. So his stones weigh about 120 pounds, and we call them talatat, and they only come from his reign. If you find a stone that is, in that size, 120 pounds, that's a talatat. And what went up so quickly also came down very quickly. So stone being very useful and very expensive and very valuable. As soon as that city was abandoned, people started to come in and take that stone away and use it for other stuff. And so it's not only the shape of those blocks, but those blocks very often had reliefs on them. And you can see, this art is a little weird. I mean, you look at this and, if you know ancient Egyptian art, you know that this is from Akhenaten's time period, because the art is just so weird. And so when you find these talatat blocks in some other place, you know that they belong to Akhenaten because the art is so weird too. And so one of the things that modern Egyptologists do is that they gather all of these talatat now from all of these many places where they've ended up, and they try to put together, it's like putting together pieces of broken pottery. They try to put together these reliefs that have been broken apart by people who took the stones and used them willy-nilly in other places. So some blocks have been joined and some bits of relief have come to light. But anyway, that is
the portraiture is fascinating, I think, and you can see it in statues of Akhenaten, but he has a face, he has a very long nose and chin, and he really looks kind of Ethiopian and, rather than Egyptian. And he usually has this kind of pot belly. The way they drew it, there's often a kind of stomach for him that I find really interesting. I just saw a picture of Tutankhamun and his wife Amukhsenaten, and they both look like that. And I don't know, was that just that period and where they did that very, sort of Nubian look?
Well, that was that period, and there's been a lot of discussion about what it means and why it was done and what the symbolism is.
Right. So here I found a photo. I think you can, no, you can't see it because I forgot that's on the screen. But there's a beautiful photograph in the book of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenaten. And you can see that kind of belly thing and even the longer nose. So there's some thought that maybe there was, in fact, African ancestry in this family because of their physiognomy, or maybe it was just the way the artist looked. But we should also mention that Tutankhamun was actually Tutankhaten until his father died, and they decided to abandon the new religion and go back to the old one.
Well, there is that too. I was also going to mention that when the early Egyptologists started to see images like we see on the screen here, they thought that Akhenaten was actually female. Because he was very fleshy, like a woman, right? Yeah. And it was a German archaeologist who figured out, I think it was Lepsius who figured out that, no, this is a guy. But yes, Tutankhamun was born probably in Akhetaten, and his name was Tutankhaten, so living image of the Aten. And some people think that Tutankhamun's father was Akhenaten. Some people are not so sure. Right. It's another part of great discussion among Egyptologists. But however that discussion runs, Akhenaten was clearly closely related to Tutankhamun. and Tutankhamun was probably born in Akhenaten. But, so Akhenaten dies. And then who takes the throne? Well, this is a sort of a shadowy period, again, greatly discussed among Egyptologists. And we think maybe Nefertiti herself may have ruled for a while, maybe as a co-regent with Akhenaten, and then after he died, she rules on her own. She may have taken a man's name because it was, again, deeply disturbing for Egyptians to have a woman on the throne. And then there was this shadowy person named Smenkhare, and he's maybe was part of this family, and how does he fit in? We don't know. We think maybe he ruled. But finally, Tutankhaten comes to the throne. And he's a child of 9. Now you have to figure that, children grew up a lot more quickly than they do now. So he probably had more agency than the typical 9-year-old these days, but still, he was a child. And the thought now was that he had advisors. He had an old family retainer named Ai, who would succeed him on the throne, and the guy who was in charge of the military, his name is Horemheb, who would succeed Ai. And these two advisors and others sort of worked with Tutankhaten to change his name to Tutankhamun, living image of the Amun. Ankhesenamun was maybe his half sister, and her name was actually Ankhesenpaten, and she had to change her name too. And then they started to set Egypt back on its traditional path. So the Temple of Amun in Karnak was restored, and people were renamed, and everybody moved back to Waset, and they just tried to restore what the ancient Egyptians called Ma'at, or the proper order of things. And so, although King Tut did not rule for that long, I think he's one of the most pivotal figures in all of ancient Egyptian history. Oh, these are the colossi of Memnon. So this is another, these are, I believe, statues of Amenhotep III. You will pass them on your way to the Valley of the Kings. And in fact, as I very often tell people, when you pass them, if you're on the proper side of the tour bus, get out your camera, because that's one of the best times to take a photograph of these statues. And what you see are the hot air balloons that go off at dawn and take you over areas around the Valley of the Kings. A quick personal story. So I was very lucky. I got sent to Egypt on a number of occasions for work by National Geographic. And I would sit in my hotel in Luxor in the morning at breakfast, super early, and watch these balloons in the sky, thinking to myself, one of these days, I want to come back and take a balloon ride. And so my husband and I were very lucky. In 2012, I think it was, a year after Arab Spring, we went back as tourists, and we had an opportunity to sign up for a hot air balloon ride, and I did get to float over the landscape in the hot air balloon. So, put stuff on your bucket list and make it happen. I think this may be one of the temples at Philae. That's what it looks like to me. And again, you can see how these these temples just got filled in with rocks and sand and broken pottery. And this is when the early explorers and the early Egyptologists came along. I mean, this is what they found. So think about the difference between this and what you see today with all of the sand sort of cleared away. But you know, these old photographs are really wonderful. And the designer for this book, Treasures of Egypt, is a man named David Griffin, and he is one of the best designers working today in the book and magazine business. And if this book looks like anything, it is thanks to David, because he just makes things look magical on the page. But it was his idea to pair old photographs like this with photographs that show these monuments and temples and tombs as they appear today, which I think is one of the really fascinating parts of the book. We tried to do that in every chapter to give you at least one spread where you see an old photograph like this and what it looks like today.
And we are very grateful for your record, because I have read that because of climate change and increasing humidity in Egypt, the climate that preserves so much of this is changing. And therefore, you know, they're making a replica of the tomb of Hatshepsut's temple, for example, because between the tourists and the climate change, the temple is beginning to really suffer. And just like the caves at Lascaux, they're going to make a facsimile, and that will be what tourists get to go to. And so I'm grateful for all these photographs, because some of this may not survive.
Yeah, yeah. This is, do you have a tag on this? What is this?
It is, I'm trying to think, I've been there, because it certainly looks familiar. It's a, you know, obviously, I think it's the temple at Karnak. I think it's the entrance to it.
I don't know.
The photographs aren't labeled, unfortunately. They're just
Right. But
Here, well, okay, so this is whatever temple this is. It is, I think it's perhaps not Karnak, because
maybe not.
because I don't see the line of sphinxes going up to it. But anyway, this is very typical of temples, most especially from the New Kingdom. You have this monumental gateway, which we call a pylon. But it really does make a statement about the building or the complex that you are going to enter through this gateway.
Okay, this is Ramses. This is the entrance to Ramses II mortuary temple at Medinet Habu.
Oh, this is Medinet Habu. Yeah.
Yep, because I found the photo. Right. Yep, and those gates were oftentimes, those are the things that survived, those amazing pylons that led you into things. Yeah.
Well, when I was first studying Egyptology, you know, people would talk about pylons, and I would think to myself, what are they? Well, this is what they are.
And there, of course, is the Sphinx with people in front of it.
Yeah. So again, this is one of the old photographs that David Griffin pulled out. Unless you are on a special tour, you can't get that close to the Sphinx these days. There's a gallery that's been built around it, and you're sort of standing up on a walkway, looking at it from afar. But on the Giza Plateau, you can have a camel ride. That's one of the things, and I did it, and I have my photograph taken on the camel. So you can do that there at Giza.
Right. So that's the Great Pyramid behind it. And I should mention that the pyramids and the Sphinx are built on what's called the Giza Plateau, which is west of Cairo. But the reason they're on the plateau was because of what Anne mentioned earlier, the Nile flooding. They had to build them where the river, you know, at a height in which the river flooding wouldn't ruin them. And so, you know, you have to go up to them. I mean, they're still on a plateau. And one of the great pleasures in going to West Cairo is to stay at the Mina House Hotel, which was a hunting lodge. And if you're sitting in the right place in your balcony and drinking your coffee when the sun comes up, the Great Pyramid will rise up right in front of you. It's really gorgeous. And then the museum that Anne mentioned, the Grand Egyptian Museum, is going to be behind that Great Pyramid, and you can walk to it from Mina House and from the plateau. So that's where it all starts. Unfortunately, the airport at Cairo is in East Cairo, and the hard part is to get from the airport across Cairo, which is one of the biggest and most congested cities in the world. And I think they are considering an underground, or they've already built to some degree, an underground tunnel or something for the road to try to get around, you know, the incredible congestion in Cairo to get out to Giza.
I was just there a month ago, and there is, instead of the old Pyramids Road, which took
Horrible.
forever, it was very interesting, and I always loved it. And I have a soft spot in my heart for the old Pyramid Road. But there's a new expressway to go out to Giza. But one of the really fun things, well, there are a couple of fun things about the Mina House. You can get rooms that allow you, that give you pyramid views.
Right.
So you get up in the morning and you fling open your curtains, and there are the pyramids, and you're just inspired for the day. But the other thing is that in the early days of archaeology in Giza, the people who were digging assembled on one of the porches of the Mina House and divvied up the concessions. So they pointed, they said, well, the French are going to dig over here, and the Germans are going to dig here, and the Americans are going to dig here, and that's how they divvied it up. But it was off one of the porches of the Mina House, and they were just looking out into the landscape and saying, well, we'll take this bit over here.
It's amazing. Are there any more photos, Patrick?
Oh, so this is at Siwa Oasis, and I have never been there. It's on my bucket list. And this is a pool that is known, I think it's the pool of Cleopatra. So the legend has it that she came here to Siwa Oasis and bathed herself in these fabulous oasis waters of the oasis. I think this symbolizes in a larger sense what is going on in the Western Desert. The Western Desert, that whole sort of desert plateau, sits atop a massive aquifer. And that means that there are, I think, 5 places in the middle, literally in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Western Desert, where water bubbles up and creates an oasis. And Siwa is one of those places. So you have grapes growing there, you have dates going there. In the Roman times, the Romans were especially interested in these places. Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome, all those soldiers running around conquering everybody everywhere. Well, they had to eat something, right? And a lot of that grain came from Egypt, not only grown along the Nile, which had seasonal growing because of the flooding of the Nile, but here in the oases, because the water was there constantly and you could have grow more than one crop every year. So the oases were very important in terms of providing grain to the Roman Empire, and also the Romans were there to control trade and traffic. There were trade routes that went across the Western Desert from the early times. I mean, even before the first kings, people were out in the desert and leaving images pecked into the rocks in the desert, even before the first kings were there.
So the Nile Delta was one of the most fertile areas in the world. In Alexandria, at the end of the independent Egypt before Rome took it over, was one of the great trading cities. But they also went south, and the metal, the gold and all that wonderful stuff really came from Nubia, which meant they had to go past the cataracts in the Nile to get to it. So there was a huge amount of constant traffic and so forth, and different groups of people that were part of ancient Egypt. It wasn't just one single family and one single culture. That's the lion guy. And he's posed like a pharaoh, isn't he? With the double uraeus and the whole bit in gold. It's beautiful. Anything else, Patrick? Are we almost?
I don't have anything to say about that. This looks to me like Karnak, those very fat columns with the capitals are, they're iconic, and you really do feel dwarfed when you stand by those colonnades. But this was a huge complex. There was, so there was the temple to Amun, there was the temple to Mut, where Betsy Bryan at the Johns Hopkins University has been working for many years. Everybody and his brother built things here and co-opted things that other kings had built, and tore down things that previous kings had built, and then built their own new stuff. So it's just a really wonderful conglomeration of monumental building from multiple reigns of multiple kings. This is, oh gosh, I can't remember what this is either.
Nor do I. Okay, well, you see the guy riding towards it, whatever it was. It was some kind of temple construction, I think.
You want me to keep going? I'm not exactly sure how many
We
photos
can
we
move on.
have.
We can move on. I have nothing to say about this.
All right.
Ah, musical instrument.
So
Beautiful.
this is a harp, and I believe this is from the New Kingdom, but the really interesting part is if you look at the very top of that harp, the head there is the head of a Nubian, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it is.
Egypt had a very interesting relationship with Nubia, and I think people are starting to think about that relationship differently. I mean, when I first started studying Egyptology, it was just that Egypt conquered Nubia, and Nubia was a conquered territory. Now I think the thought is, there was an ebb and flow. There were times, certainly, when Egyptian presence was very much down in Nubia, and the Egyptians, certainly in the Middle Kingdom, built a lot of forts down there. Nubia was the source of gold. It was also the gateway to parts of Africa to the south that provided things like leopard skins and baboons and ostrich eggs and elephant tusks and stuff like that. But there were also times when Nubia had the upper hand, most especially one of the later dynasties, the 25th dynasty, Egypt was sort of having a low moment, and the Nubians decided that they were going to come in and take over Egypt and restore Ma'at. They were very traditional, restore things as they should be. And so the so-called Black Pharaohs ruled Egypt for a dynasty. So I guess this harp just sort of symbolizes that ebbing and flowing of the relationship between Nubia and Egypt, and the fact that Egyptologists are starting to look at it in a very different light.
You bet. And if you go to Aswan, one of the principal things to see in Aswan is there's an extraordinary Nubian museum, and it's all filled with things from Nubia. It's right around the corner from the Cataract Hotel. And it's amazing. You can spend a whole day there and see how they are re-examining all that. There's even a Nubian village near Aswan, which were basically a kind of underclass that provided servants and so forth. And if you can ever find it, there's a woman named Lauren Haney, Haney, who wrote a series of mysteries. Unfortunately, I think they were just in paperback and probably don't exist anymore. And they were set at the first cataract and had a lot to do with explaining how Egypt and Nubia, they traded and how they got together, and how you even crossed the river, because it was incredibly dangerous at the cataracts. People drowned all the time trying to go across it. So this is what, is this a canal on the way to Saqqara? That's what it looks like.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
the point to this photograph is that in antiquity, Egypt was an agricultural country,
Yeah.
and in many ways still is. And this scene is just timeless. If you are out in the countryside, and you are there, I think this is at dawn, and the mist is just sort of lifting off. This is not the Nile. I think this is one of the canals that are used for irrigation. But this is just very typical. People go to their fields on their donkeys and take their cattle to graze. They're very often growing alfalfa to feed their cattle and their donkeys. And so the fields are, just a beautiful emerald green. And they grow other things as well. I remember on one of my first work trips to Egypt, I got very taken with carrots that were piled up in pyramid shaped piles by the side of the road for sale, because the carrots were purple carrots. So, our driver was so taken with me being taken with these carrots that he pulled over, got out of the car, bought some carrots and brought them back so that I could taste them. And they tasted like normal carrots, they were just purple. But anyway, that's just one of the things that people are growing here.
I have read that Lake Marietta, which is up at the Nile Delta, up near Alexandria, at this point in time is only 17% of the area that it occupied in ancient Egypt when it was really huge. And when Alexander expanded Alexandria, which was just a little fishing village, that there was this huge lake of fresh water not very far from the ocean. And they built a canal between Lake Marietta and the Mediterranean to help shipping, but it's now shrunk a drastic degree. And of course, the Aswan Dam has actually interrupted the natural flow of how the Nile worked. It's also kept the animals from moving back and forth. They can't go through the dam, so the hippopotami and other things are stuck on one side of the dam or the other. So there's some downsides to the Aswan Dam as well as some pluses. This is a boat building deal. And there's a terrific boat out by the big pyramid in Giza, but I suspect it's being moved into Gem, isn't it, Anne?
It has been moved to the Gem. That was one of Khufu's funerary boats.
Yeah.
There were two of them that were discovered, and one of them was reconstructed from more than these boats had been, so these boats were built from cedar planks that had been imported from Lebanon. Cedar is a really wonderful wood. It resists salt water, it resists insects, it's flexible, and you can get really long, straight planks from it. And of course, Egypt doesn't have a lot of forests. It has, some scrubby acacia and some sycamores, that's okay for making small things like pegs. But when you want to build a big royal boat, as we see here, I think this is the tomb of Ti, you need to import wood from Lebanon. And so Khufu had two of these massive boats built and then deconstructed and buried in pits that had been cut into the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau. So in 1954, one of those boats was found, and I think reconstruction started in 1957, if I remember correctly. And the man who was doing it was an Egyptian, one of the master restorers. And he was working with more than 1,000 separate pieces. And these planks were very cool because they had holes drilled through them, because these planks were actually sewn together with rope. And then when the water hit them, the ropes would swell and bring the planks flush together, and the boat would be watertight. But anyway, from about the 1960s through, I think it was August 2021, this boat from this pit was on display right near Khufu's pyramid in its own museum. I think it was called the Solar Boat Museum.
It was a wonderful thing to visit.
And it was fabulous. But you know, there were issues in climate control, and the decision was made to move that boat to the gem. So it moved to the gem in August 2021, and I think the parts of the boat in the second pit, some of those parts have already been moved to the gem, and the rest of the parts are going to be moved, and then the two boats will be reconstructed and be side by side in the gem. I think that is the plan.
Which will be great. Patrick, I realize suddenly it's 4:15. We've gone way over, so maybe we should stop the slideshow. I have a couple of photos I can show you. This is actually how, can I do it without the light shining on it? This is the boat museum. That's how it looked by the pyramids. But I was going to show you, because this is my very favorite photo. This is the view you get from Mina House. You can look right through the gate and see the Great Pyramid behind it. And if you are there in the morning, you can see it. Where is it? Where is my photo of it rising up? And so this is how it looks with this wonderful view of the pyramid, and you can see it through the palm trees and so forth. But I was going to find you, before we quit, I was going to find you what the entrance to King Tut's, because, you know, for all the excitement and all of the glamour and all the rest of it that surrounds King Tut's tomb, in point of fact, it's actually sort of pedestrian to go visit it today. It has this little, there it is, has a little funny sign outside that says Tomb of Tutankhamun. And then you can see there's a couple of, this is how one of the paintings looks inside around the sarcophagi. But the most famous thing inside it is that you can see is this wall of baboons. It's kind of hard to see them with my phone, sorry. But, you know, because it's been emptied, what they've left there is the mummy, isn't it, Anne? Isn't his actual mummy in the tomb? I think it is.
The mummy is there. There's been a lot of discussion about leaving the mummy there, but there are a lot of people who argue very strenuously that King Tut needs to be in the place where he was buried.
That's right.
Because when his Ka comes back, his Ka will be looking in the tomb for the mummy, and if the Ka cannot find the mummy, you know, that's not a good thing. So,
true. And that's the photograph of Carnarvon and Howard Carter when they're standing there, kind of opening up the tomb, which they found. Anyway, it's a really interesting story. It's KV, Kings Valley 62 is the nomenclature. But if you go there, I recommend very much that they rotate it. They only allow you to go, I think it's 5 tombs a day. They're trying to control it. So you can't just spend a whole day going in and out of tombs. You have to pick whatever it is. And then you can also go to the Valley of the Queens, and there's a couple of fabulous tombs over there. You have a photo of Nefertari in the book, not Nefertiti, but Nefertari, who was the beloved wife of Ramses II. It was his favorite wife, and he built her this extraordinary tomb. So, you know, there's endless stuff to see. But as I said, a lot of it is going to turn into facsimiles, or it's going to go undercover or something because of climate change and the damage to it. That the dry, arid climate that allowed all this stuff to survive is changing. And, you know, with Ethiopia building its own dam, and the Nile, you know, the flow of the Nile is going to be changing as well. There's just a lot happening. So I think your book is an incredible treasure. And as I said, it's my favorite recommendation for a Christmas gift. Anybody will like it. And there's associated books that have also come out called The Royal Couple, about Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun, or maybe it's about Akhenaten and Nefertiti, I can't remember. But anyway, there's a number of publications, and I put them all together in our November book news. So if you go to poisonpen.com and click on book news and then look for the PDF for the November issue, there's a whole section of books starting with this one but other supporting books about this wonderful 100th anniversary. So Anne, thank you very much for spending time with us. Last year, we talked about lost tombs and ancient cities. Do we have a project for next year?
Well, I have a project, but it's not going to be in a hardback book.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.